Morning, everyone. So yeah, Steve basically introduced that I'm going to be talking about building distributed call centers. The main reason I'm talking about this is because over the last year and a half or so, I built a distributed call center for a company where they had a centralized system in the middle, where they had two systems for hot failover, and then outside of that, they had different physical locations that were very small. They had satellite offices, and they wanted to allow the incoming calls from those systems that were physically coming into them to be answered by agents out in Jacksonville, and vice versa for the satellite offices to be able to answer questions that were coming into the primary office and answer any overflow, or for the satellite offices to be able to answer calls for each other, essentially. So calls would come in from each of the systems in the satellite offices and be able to send that over an MPLS network between the satellite offices so everyone could answer. It was all database driven and things like that. So that's kind of what this talk is going to be based around. I'm going to start from very simple systems and work my way up to more complex systems. I'm probably going to speak fast just because I have usually a lot of stuff to get through, so apologies if you missed something. If you really need me to slow down something, just put your hand up and be like, hey, can you re-explain that, and we'll see where we're at. Otherwise, I'll speak to you outside the room after the talk. So I'm an Asterisk consultant, obviously, since I'm building systems, and also co-author of Asterisk the Future of Telephony, which is based on Asterisk 1.4, and we're currently working on updating that to the 1.8 version, which is going to be called Asterisk the Definitive Guide. That sounded like my phone. What I do with Digium is I'm the bug marshal, so I'll triage a lot of the issues, if not all of the issues, on the bug tracker and make sure that we have all the information appropriate for developers to start working on the issue. And I'm also the Asterisk release manager, which basically means I run a script and put packages out and create a release announcement and get Asterisk out to the world. And basically specialize in database integration and distributed call center implementations. That just seems to be what I've been asked to do. Really started with Steve, I don't know, years ago, 6 years ago or something, and we built a distributed ITSP based on Asterisk 1.4, where they had two physical locations. So that's where my clustering and database integration work started, and then it moved into the call center areas, working with some other clients. So I'm going to describe some various call center setups. We're going to start very, very simple, things that you're going to recognize, and increase in complexity where you might still recognize it based on whether you've developed call centers or worked in call centers and things like that. And then getting into some more complex scenarios where we have multiple systems, and those systems need to handle calls and distribute them to other systems where other users exist within different physical networks and things like that. A lot of my stuff is typically database driven, although I've started moving into using things like LDAP and curl and some other methods of distributing the data, but it all ends up kind of working the same way. It's just the tools that you're going to use that you're used to using and what makes it easier and make more sense for you, because if you're going to be managing that system, you want to make sure that you're comfortable with the tools that you're using. So basically, I'm just going to have a topology. We're going to look at a picture, and then I'll have a slide, and it's going to have information, and I'll talk about that topology. So we're probably all fairly familiar with this. We have our traditional PBX. We have a PRI, or maybe a whole bunch of analog lines coming into that system, and it distributes via analog or maybe ISDN phones, depending on the system and where you are in the world, distributing calls from that PBX to the phones. So it's usually fairly limited. It might do exactly what you need. I know lots of people just work in that methodology, but I've started working with a call center that started with that type of scenario, but have wanted to start adding additional functionality. They want to be able to support remote clients. They want people to be able to have different features and be able to move between desks and things like that. So sometimes those types of features are missing from a more traditional telephony system. It's usually not distributable, which means we can't have multiple systems and connect them all together. And if you can, you're typically running the calls over PRI, back out, and using lines that would better be used for an incoming call and things like that. So we can't utilize our internet connection or other methodologies of being able to get the calls between systems. And in almost in all cases, you're going to have to be physically connected to the system at the physical location, and you can't be remote. So here's a hybrid system. We take our existing system, and assuming that we have the ability to add a secondary PRI or some other method of getting calls out of the system, we can do something like this where we connect Asterisk to our existing system and start adding additional functionality. This is usually a good place where people are migrating but can't just rip a system out and rely on the new system like the very next day. This is a way of getting transitioned into a different system, adding remote clients, start using things like SIP, and getting the calls moved from one system to another, while at the same time still staying in business and keeping all our existing calls and call flow up and running. So Asterisk is an enabler in this scenario. We start adding our SIP endpoints, which allows us to, again, use the functionality and the features that SIP provide us. We're still somewhat limited by physical connections because we still have our PRI, we still have our existing analog lines. Not everyone can be remote because we have to use all our existing infrastructure. But and you're still limited by having to buy hardware, which is not a bad thing. But some people are trying to move away from PRI. Some people rely on PRI. So you're still limited based on what kinds of things you need to use. I'm a big fan of remote employees and enabling that functionality. The costs of having a remote employee, and not just by the morale of them being able to be remote and be at home and be able not have to basically drive to your facility, is you can also expand into different time zones so they're more comfortable in that time zone, and you can also allow them to basically pay for your electricity and internet costs, because if you might maybe give them some money to do that, but you're not necessarily paying to run the computers, you're not paying for all the lighting, you're not paying for all those things that a company still has to expand into, or maybe you can keep the same, you can expand physically with a number of people, but you can keep the same facility without having to move. So here's like kind of the opposite of what we're looking at, which is pretty much a pure Asterisk, but still a non-distributed system. We have our ITSP, which is our Internet Telephony Service Provider. We're taking calls in, sending calls out over a cheaper connection. We have our PRI as either a redundant system, or maybe it's a transition phase, or maybe it's something that is just, we need to have the PRIs. We need to rely on that functionality and that call quality, because perhaps you're not, you don't trust your ISP to deliver calls all the time, but you can definitely use it for maybe just long distance calls, maybe use it in single direction. And we still have our SIP phones. We've transitioned into that entirely, and then we still use our internet connection and get remote employees into our facility. So, and the good thing with this is we essentially have no limitation on the number of lines. If Asterisk can handle the call and the ITSP can handle the call, you're a lot further off. The call center I built in Jacksonville has a single PRI, but they've moved almost entirely over to SIP. They still have their PRI that they're using for their incoming calls, but they're using it practically not at all for any outgoing calls. All outgoing calls are pretty much going over SIP, and it's dropped their costs dramatically because they haven't had to buy more PRIs and pay for that on a monthly charge. Their long distance calls are much cheaper. They're basically flat rated at like a penny a minute. And it's allowed them to expand their business into something that they weren't originally looking to do. They've essentially become a virtual PBX for people, for some companies. So after hours, say a lawyer sends a call to their DID, which they had provisioned through the ITSP, which took like 5 seconds, and it's immediately up and available, comes into Asterisk. You just match on the phone number, and then just say, okay, this routing is going to go to this portion of the dial plan, and we set up the caller ID, and when it comes in, the agents know who the client is and can answer the phone as if they are working for that client, and take information down and save it, and then basically forward it back to the lawyer in the morning and say, okay, I took these calls last night. No one was at your office, but we took all these calls because they're all on the West Coast, say, perhaps, and send all that information to you, and now you can follow up with them. So it, plus having someone to actually answer the phone and take that information makes people feel a lot better, like, oh, I actually got a real person. So, I'm going to go with these people because I'm actually not just talking to a machine or leaving a voicemail and just hoping that somebody will call me back in the morning. So as I mentioned before, this gives us some remote employee stuff where we can save on electricity costs and increase the employee morale and things like that. We're somewhat limited in expandability in this situation just because it's a single system. We can max out the system, but at some point you have to get a little more complex. So with that scenario that I was kind of giving with the phone numbers coming in and looking up information on the database, this is essentially the system I'm talking about here. We have a database that's connected to our Asterisk system. All our routing information is pulled out of the database so we can look up things. Essentially, the dial plan becomes static, and the database has all the dynamic information. So we add information on the database, and Asterisk doesn't have to be reloaded, doesn't have to be changed. You don't have to add new dial plan functionality. You just keep the excuse me. You just keep the dial plan static and work around all the dynamic data and let all that information exist outside of Asterisk, and you're saving a lot of the administrative overhead to do that. The good thing with this type of a scenario is the web interface is external to Asterisk. It's not writing dial plan. It doesn't even have to know anything about Asterisk. And the advantage to that is when you start employing someone to do web development for you, they're probably going to be comfortable working with a database, but they might not know anything about Asterisk or really have any desire to learn anything about Asterisk because they're a web developer. That's what they want to do. So by abstracting the data out to the database, Asterisk talks to the database, has this information that it can work with, and the web interface can just talk to the database and just work with that information, and you abstract the two methodologies, and it makes it a lot easier to work with. Let's see if there's anything. Oh, so the way I interact in the dial plan with the database is using something called FuncODBC. So you do calls from Asterisk over through an ODBC connection to the database, and you basically do your select statements or inserts or updates or whatever you need to do, get that information back down into your Asterisk system, and then you do your call routing based on that information. Last year I started looking at FuncCurl as well, which is pretty neat. It's basically taking the information off of a web page and pulling it into the dial plan, or accessing from the dial plan to a web page and pulling the information off of that. One of the ways that I was using FuncCurl was for long distance routing to determine what the rates were going to be and whether I wanted to limit the ability for someone to call out to those numbers. Let's say it's maybe more than a penny a minute. Let's say it's 27 cents a minute because they're calling overseas.